Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We work with hedge funds, family offices, registered investment advisors, and individuals like you to help you get better returns in the stock market. I am here with our host, Robb Fahrion, the CEO and founder of Flying V, our digital marketing partner. Robb is clearly here straight from the set of American Graffiti. Robb, what's going on with the new hairdo?
It's getting a little long, maybe time for a cut, but just trying to work with what I've got, work with what my mom gave me. Not much, but hey, I'll make it work. I actually got a compliment on my hair today on Twitter. So we were talking about that. Gary got into a fight. I got a compliment on my hair. So I guess you can wonder whose day's going what direction at this point.
Exactly. All right. Well, let me know how it goes at the sock hop.
I will. I will, no doubt about it. So, as always, yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. We've got a great show, as always, on the five things with Deep Knowledge Investing and Gary Brode, another special guest that we'll introduce here in a minute that we're really excited to talk to. Today, we're talking Bank of Japan again, Federal Reserve, as always, talking TikTok, 2% inflation, and commercial real estate popping up in the five things again today. We're going to go a little bit out of order from the written version. We've got a special guest who I'll let Gary introduce here in a second. So we're actually going to start with thing number 3 and TikTok facing a forced sale. But what comes next, Gary?
So, Robb, I got to tell you, when I started Deep Knowledge Investing, at no point did I think I would be discussing TikTok. And yet, here we are.
Here we are.
Right. And to make things even better, we have brought in a fantastic attorney. Phil Kessler of Kessler and Green is a phenomenal attorney. He is also, I'm proud to say, a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. And Phil knows a ton about the Constitution. He has actually argued a case through the United States Supreme Court and won it. He is a phenomenal expert when it comes to all things related to the court. And the case that we're talking about today actually could end up in an appellate court or possibly in front of the Supreme Court. Phil, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for your very nice comments. Always overly generous.
All right. So we're talking about the situation with TikTok. Last week, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 352 to 65 to force ByteDance, which is the owner of TikTok, to divest its subsidiary TikTok or be banned in the United States. Now, there's an interesting question. How exactly do you ban a website and an application that is used by well over 100 million Americans? I've actually read it's 170 million. But there's a really interesting question. Should this be done and can it be done? So for that, we're going to go to Phil. Now, one of the things I'm going to add before we do that is that there are a lot of people saying, hey, TikTok isn't really a Chinese company. There are all kinds of companies like BlackRock, General Atlantic, Susquehanna, the Carlyle Group that own interests in it. And that may be technically true, although I will point out that typically those ownerships in Chinese companies aren't actual ownership. They're typically holding shares or like shadow shares headquartered in the Cayman Islands that don't really exercise control of the company. But either way, the key issue is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has what they call a golden share. They own 1% of ByteDance, but with that golden share, that enables the CCP to appoint a director to the board of ByteDance, provides the CCP with veto rights over business decisions, and most importantly, ensures the Chinese Communist Party has access to data from ByteDance and its subsidiaries. Who owns the company is not relevant. The key thing here is that the Chinese Communist Party has access to all of this data and they are harvesting it. Phil, is this legal? Is this reasonable? What should Congress be doing here?
Well, let's start with where we are. We have a bill that was passed by a substantial majority of the House of Representatives. Obviously, it has to go to the Senate. It's going to go to the Senate. It's been sent to the Senate, and the Senate will do whatever they decide to do with it. So the first question is, will anything come of this that's a law? That's a political question. My political read is probably, but who knows? Will it read it being a statute, that something that is approved and enacted by the Senate, that the House then reapproves if it's changed, can that then, is it going to look anything like it reads now? Don't know. Again, that's political. What I see in reading this is something that lawyers and judges struggle with all the time. It is a document, a bill that's not all that clearly drafted in many respects. There are indications from what I've read in the commentaries, and you've read them too, that this was rushed through. That obviously that comes from people who are being critical of it. There's always another side to the story, but some of it reads as if it was rushed through, or the people who were involved in drafting it didn't use their time well if it wasn't rushed through. In any event, there's room for argument about lots of it. And so I think what the Senate will do and should is to take a very close look at some of the underlying premises. The clear object here arises from a concern which appears to have been reached as a conclusion by the FBI and other intelligence organizations. I can't speak to the accuracy of their conclusions or the firmness of their conclusions, basis of their conclusions, other than things that we have heard them quoted as saying. So we don't know the detail. So to assume for this discussion that I would hope that the Senate would make very sure that they understand in detail the basis of those concerns and can conclude, if they're inclined to do something here, that TikTok really does create a bona fide national security risk. It isn't something that's being hysterically blown out of proportion and isn't in the real world much of a risk at all. I hope they will one other resolve the question. So that would be the first.
Okay, so while we don't know how the Senate's going to vote, the vote in the House of Representatives was 352 to 65. That does indicate that the bill in that form, at least in the House, had bipartisan support.
Absolutely. And there were people in the House who were involved in intelligence matters who were very strongly in favor of the bill and advocates for the bill, which doesn't end the inquiry, but it does give it some colorable credibility.
Okay, so Phil, some people are saying that this is a First Amendment issue, right? That they have the right to use TikTok to say what they want, to advocate for whatever policies they want, or just dance on TikTok. Is this a First Amendment issue?
I don't really think so. It's something that at the surface looks like a First Amendment issue, but really isn't. There is no one on TikTok, so far as I can see, who if TikTok goes away, would be in any way limited, restricted, prohibited from expressing whatever they've expressed on TikTok or might want to express on TikTok in other major social media. So it isn't really true that somebody's speech is being chilled. It's rather like, if you go way back in the time machine, it's like somebody's soapbox being removed because there's a bona fide concern that the soapbox is somehow dangerous. And there are lots of other soapboxes in the vicinity that speakers who might use that soapbox can choose to use to express whatever they would have expressed on that soapbox. It really isn't. This is an attack on the machine, on the what I would describe as a speaking machine that's maybe also a spying machine. But it doesn't eliminate the speech.
So I think that's the key issue, right? The Wall Street Journal had a great example on that editorial page last week that if you use your pen to write something, that's free speech. If you use your pen to pick a lock and steal documents, that's an action that's not protected by the Constitution. And so the Journal further in the same article reported, I'm quoting from them, TikTok collects reams of sensitive data on US users, including their locations, search and browsing histories, keystroke patterns, and biometrics. That data is shared with the CCP. So I think the point of the bill isn't to limit people's free speech, their constitutional First Amendment right to say what they want. I think what they're trying to do is put a stop to foreign spying on well over 100 million Americans. So I think one of the things you and I talked about when we were discussing this last week is there's a difference between speech and action. Is that the right delineation here?
You could look at it that way. The way I see it is this is not about the speech. The speech is what lawyers and judges sometimes refer to as a red herring. It's about what the machine, my term, what the site is allegedly being used for, to spy on the United States. It's not about the speech. It's about how this machine is being used. And so again, if you eliminate the machine completely, if TikTok goes away, is it reasonable to believe that anyone who might otherwise hope to, expect to, plan on conveying ideas of his or of hers on TikTok would be prevented from conveying those ideas in equally effective social media? Is that a reasonable thing to conclude? And my answer is it's an unreasonable thing to conclude. No one's speech is being chilled, much less prohibited.
Okay, so that tees up the last question I've got for you, because you are somebody who has read the bill. Lots of people who are discussing it haven't. One of the things that came up, and we did touch on this in this week's written version of the 5 things, there seemed to be a lot of concern that people have that the way the bill is written could allow Congress or the White House to shut down Twitter if, say, they didn't like the way Elon Musk was positioning that platform going into the November elections, or actually enabled Congress or the White House to shut down individual websites who they might call misinformation. Other people might say, hey, listen, this is our right to speak the truth. This is how we see things. Based on your reading of the bill, are there potential hazards for platforms like Twitter or individual websites who would be owned by Americans, run by Americans, who would be engaging in speech that Washington, D.C. might not like, but would be covered under the First Amendment?
The structure and content of this bill, especially in its definitional sections, and there are definitional sections, they're interrelated in a way that's somewhat confusing in the way the interrelationships and the definitions are expressed. Having said that, so there's room for some argument about what some aspects of this bill really mean, but I don't see any room for argument that that an application, a website that isn't controlled by an entity or a person or both in a foreign adversary, which is clearly defined as 4 countries. It's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, and it's North Korea, period. They don't say and others. It's one of those. And in the absence of that kind of control, direct or indirect, I don't see any possibility of Mr. Musk's Twitter being shut down, at least not on the basis of anything in this bill.
So, Phil, I read dozens of articles on this. Your take on it, identifying that the bill is narrowly written regarding 4 enemy countries and is not an insane power grab by the people in Washington, D.C. That is lacking from every article I've read. Your perspective on this, I think, adds just an enormous amount to the discussion. Thank you for that. For people who are interested in, your views on such things or your legal services, how can they find you?
Find me at Kessler and Green LLP, easy to look up, easy to find in New York City.
All right. Terrific. Phil Kessler, great to have you. So glad to have you on the DKI Board of Advisors. And thanks for joining us tonight.
I appreciate the invitation. It's been fun and great to see Robb's new hairstyle.
Thanks so much, Phil. Really appreciate your time.
I knew you would.
All right, Phil. We'll see you later. I'll talk to you later. So long.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Phil. Awesome.
All
I'm
right.
just glad. I can take the insults at my haircut. I'm just glad he didn't talk about any of my legal writing that I have.
The real problem is I didn't know what your hair looked like before.
Oh,
I gather this is a different style.
I guess. Gary's got a keen eye.
Very
All
nice. All right.
Well, great
Thanks,
All
Phil.
right, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Phil,
Take care.
Phil, thanks for joining us, and be sure to check out Phil and his group online. And if you need any direction, check out the weekly written 5 things. We got some links in there out to his website and firm. Moving forward, thing number 1, which will be thing number 2, we reorganized a little bit here. Gary, the Fed keeps rates stable and the dot plot is unchanged.
Yeah, so the Federal Reserve concluded their March meeting. They have 2-day meetings. They do that, I think, 10 times a year. And unsurprisingly, they kept the Fed funds rate unchanged. This is something that would have been a surprise just a few months ago. Now, for anybody who's been watching the show for the last few months, I've been saying there is no way in the world the Fed was going to cut in January. I said there was no way they were going to cut in March, and that we were not going to see 6 interest rate decreases this year for a total of 1.5%. So far, we've been right. The market has adjusted in our direction on that. And the Federal Reserve did what we expected. They kept the Fed funds rate the same. It's now at 5.3%. And the interesting part of the release was the dot plot. Now, the dot plot is what comes out. It comes out 4 times a year. And they ask every member, every Fed governor, to plot out where they think interest rates will be this year, next year, the year after, and then in the long run. And the reason the dot plot is interesting is because you can see the Fed vote is always unanimous, but you can see where there are people saying, hey, we don't think we're going to cut it all this year. And there were other people saying, no, we think we're going to cut 4 times or 5 times. And you can see this range of opinions. And it's the one place where the Federal Reserve, which typically speaks with one voice, it's the one place where they actually let us see a divergence in opinion. And so this week, the dot plot came out and it showed that the majority of Fed governors thought we'd have 3 interest rate decreases. That's consistent with what we saw last time. And the market breathed a sigh of relief because they thought we were potentially only going to get 1 or 2 decreases, right? That the Fed was becoming more hawkish. Instead, they said, no, we're going to keep things pretty much the same. And the market had a relief rally and was up. The release came out at 2:00, and by 2:03, the market was up. People were looking at the dot plot before they were reading the release.
Gary, during the press conference, appeared to be some contradictory statements in there regarding the rate cuts. One implying cuts when inflation's back down to 2%, but another before that. What did you make of this political theater drama? What was it?
Yeah, so Rob, that wasn't so much during the press conference, although Powell's press conferences are hilarious in their own way. We forgot to say this week's episode is the economic hilarity episode. And basically what happens is Powell stands in front of the press for an hour. Every single person asks him some different version of the same question, which is, when are you going to lower rates? And Powell, you can see him desperately trying to not look annoyed and not trying to be snarky and say, what is wrong with you idiots? I've answered this 15 times today for the 16th time. We're data driven. I don't know when we're going to lower rates. But there was some very interesting language in the press release. And this is what we were focused on. And so I'm looking for the exact language. So at one point, the press release said the Fed would cut when it had greater confidence inflation was moving towards the 2% target. Okay. Now, this is going to sound like nitpicking, but I assure you, the Fed goes over every single word of these releases. The finance community goes through every single word of these releases. The Fed knows that we all have comparisons. This is what they said last time. This is what they said this time. And we are looking at every change of words. So we can assume that every word they put in there is meaningful. And so when they say greater confidence inflation was moving towards the 2% target, what that means is they're prepared to lower rates before inflation hits 2%, right? And so you see that and you think, wait a minute, these guys are shifting the inflation target. Maybe they'll do it at 3%, at 2.5%. And this, by the way, is the same thing Arthur Burns did in the 1970s that led to massive inflation. He let off too early. He let off when inflation was heading towards the target. Now, here's the Fed saying, yeah, we're considering doing the exact same thing. And I assure you, every person in the room knows that story. They know that history. But then just a sentence later, it says that they are, here it is. I'm quoting from the release. The committee is strongly committed to returning inflation to its 2% objective. That is drawing a hard line, very hawkish, right? We're going to get you to 2% on inflation, and we will not let up until it happens. Now, why would they do this? Right? Why in one sense would they say, hey, we'll ease up when it's on the way, we're making progress. And the other one, they're saying, this is the target. This is what we're going for. And the answer is this opacity, this saying one thing, saying something else is deliberately in there so that later they have a variety of options they can consider. And no matter what, like, yeah, we told you we were going to do this, right? It's kind of like, asking if there will be dessert after dinner. And, mom and dad say, there might be dessert. There is dessert. There might not be dessert. We're not sure. And then whatever happens, like, yeah, we told you.
The spin zone, I think you can call it.
Exactly.
Great. Gary, thing number 3, we're moving back to Japan. The Bank of Japan goes above 0.
Yeah. So we have talked about Japan extensively before. And the Bank of Japan has kept their version of the Fed funds rate. They call it the immediate interest rate, which is their version of the overnight rate, the Fed funds rate. They've had it at, around, and actually below 0 for the better part of a decade and a half. It's actually been below 0 since, I want to say, 2015. They've had negative interest rates. This is completely insane for 9 years to have negative interest rates. What's happened is the Japanese government has run up debt of somewhere in the neighborhood of 260% of GDP, their gross domestic product. That is an enormous number. And the reason they were able to do that is because their cost of funds was so low, in some cases actually negative, right? Well, the other side of that is we've had a massive carry trade. So what people have done is they have sold Japanese bonds, which were yielding right around 0, used that to buy US treasuries, which were yielding something higher. They captured the interest spread. It's called the carry trade, and trillions of dollars have been put into that. Well, what happens when people are selling the yen and buying the dollar? The yen collapses. And over the last couple of years, the yen has gone from 102 to the dollar to 151 to the dollar. That is a 50% collapse in the value of the yen. Finally, last week, the Bank of Japan, after much hand waving, said, okay, we're going to go above 0. We're going to go above 0. We're going to go above 0. And then they finally did it. And they raised their immediate interest rate, their version of the Fed funds rate, from negative 0.1% to a range of 0 to 0.1%.
Remarkable. And so my question on that is, you're talking about such a slight move, right? What was the point of it? Was there a point of it? Did they get the reaction that they wanted? Was it window dressing? Doesn't seem to be like it made much of a difference.
Yeah. So the reason they did it, it's not because the Japanese government wants to pay more in interest expense. They can't afford it, right? If they raise interest rates to anything resembling a normal level, it'll blow out their budget, right? Imagine, running up a huge credit card bill, and then, the credit card company says, hey, that 0% rate we gave you for 6 months, now we're going to start charging you 20%. All of a sudden, that credit card bill is going to become huge. That's what the Japanese government is facing. So you're asking, why did they do this? Why did they raise rates? The simple answer is because the yen had slid from 102 to the dollar to 151. They're doing that to protect their currency. They need to do this. It's very important in Japan. Japan is a huge economy. It's the world's fourth largest economy, but it's also a small island nation without a lot in the way of natural resources. They have to import almost all of their energy. Energy is typically priced in dollars. And so, for everyone listening to this, think about how frustrated you are when you go to put gas in your car, you fill up your tank, and the bill is high. Now try to imagine doing that with a currency that's depreciated 50% against the dollar. It's a problem. That's why the Bank of Japan raised rates. And they were so timid about it, right? They were doing it to protect the yen, but they were so timid going from negative 0.1 to 0 to 0.1 that the market laughed at them. And instead of protecting the yen actually fell on the day. It was down, a fraction of 1%. But this action that the Bank of Japan took to shore up their currency actually had the opposite effect, simply because people said, okay, we see you're not serious and we don't really care if your reference rate is negative 0.1 or positive 0.05%. We're not buying it. And they didn't. They sold the yen more.
Gary, we want to call out real quick our sponsor for this week's 5 Things, Unicus Research, coming to you again as a sponsor for the 5 Things. Unicus Research is a short-based, independent investigative research firm. They perform in-depth research on their ideas, including speaking with industry sources, which gives their clients an investment edge on their recommendation. Unicus's ideas have generated more than 70% ROI on the downside for their clients. If you have, again, the written version of the 5 Things, you can check out their track record by going to unicusresearch.com/track record.
Actually,
moving
Rob,
on.
go
ahead.
Before we move on, I want to add one thing. So we had Lax Ganapathy, the CEO of Unicus Research, on the 5 Things last week, and she was talking about EVs, and that segment grabbed a lot of attention, and it was controversial. She's very negative on the environmental impact of electric vehicles. And she wrote a phenomenal, lengthy piece last week that I had the chance to read. And fortunately, this morning, Lax gave us permission to publish it. So for people who are interested or found her controversial comments last week to be enlightening or interesting or concerning, you can go to the Deep Knowledge Investing website, deepknowledgeinvesting.com, click on the research tab, and we have, with Unicus's permission, printed the entire article, and you can read a massive amount of research regarding the environmental impact of electric vehicles. It's a long read, but I strongly recommend it. It is phenomenally well researched.
As a DKI subscriber as well, be sure when you reach out to Unicus, they'll offer 15% discount for your first 2 years over there with them, and their financial newsletter will be complimentary as well. So thanks to Lax and the team over there. Thing number 4, Gary, as we move on in this week's version of the 5 Things, going back to inflation, the 2% inflation target is random and unchanged.
Yeah. So where we got the idea for this tweet, one of the for this thing, as I was on Twitter or X, one of my favorite follows there is Dario Perkins. It's at Dario Perkins, and he put up what I thought was a very funny economics tweet. Yeah, it's the economic hilarity episode, but it's a chart for the United States inflation target rate, which has been 2% for decades. And so it's this chart with just a flat line.
Yeah, it's a great chart.
Right. And so, the whole thing, it's, if you're into economics and economic history, right, it made some of us laugh. And I thought it was a very funny tweet by Dario. But it brought to mind this really interesting question that people have asked: where did this 2% inflation target come from? And it's actually almost 40 years ago. A New Zealand finance minister was being questioned on television, and somebody asked him, what's your estimate for a sustainable and healthy rate of inflation? And the guy, he wasn't expecting the question. Nobody had really thought about it. And he started stammering, had difficulty answering the question, and eventually just kind of blurted out 1%. And, the report of it kind of implies like 1%, like he was making it up as he was going on. And then that later, a couple of years later, got adjusted by some other people in the finance department to 2%. And then that number got adopted by central banks. And it's been the number for decades. But basically, one guy in a small country on TV blurts out a number that some flunky in the back office adjusts later. And now every central bank around the world is using this like it's a real thing. And so it actually made Dario's tweet even funnier, because we're graphing something that's always unchanged, but it's not just that it's unchanged. It's a random number. It was randomly made up by a guy.
The disagreement, Gary, that you talked about a little bit in the 5 things too, is that the inflation theft issue, and some people thinking that will actually have more economic growth with higher inflation. Why do you disagree with those people?
Yeah. So look, I've had this argument with people for years, and some of you listening to this are going to disagree. If you do, great, put it in the comments, right? But tell me why you disagree. Here's the issue. A lot of people claim that without inflation, we'd have a stagnant economy. That basically inflation produces economic growth, because if people know that prices are going to go up, it incentivizes us to go out and consume now. And that if we had flat prices or decreasing prices, nobody would spend money. The whole economy would stall. And that's generally the argument as it's presented to me, to which I claim that is complete nonsense. Here's why. What I did was, I did research. So I called our college student and intern, Andrew Brown, and I went through. I said, Andrew, let me guess what you spend your money. He's like, yeah, go ahead. I'm like, well, so tuition. He's at the University of Tennessee. He's like, yep. I said, your, room and board, either an apartment or a dorm. He says, yep. I said, food. He said, yep. Car payment, auto insurance. He's like, oh yeah, I have to have that. I said, I'm guessing the most valuable thing you have in your dorm room is the computer you have for school. He said, yeah, you nailed it. I said, okay, well, of those items, right? What percent of your annual spending does that cover? He says, pretty close to 100%,
yeah.
Right? So let me ask you, right? For the people who argue that we need inflation to have economic growth, and without inflation, people would have no incentive to spend, what would he wait for? So would he not house himself or pay for an education or have a computer for school or feed himself or have a car because these items might be cheaper next year? Of course not. And in fact, one of the most interesting things in the United States, at least, one of the greatest consumer growth industries over the last 40, 50 years has been in electronics. And every year, computing power gets cheaper. Cell phones get more powerful, right? And the older ones become cheaper, right? Whatever cell phone you have in your pocket, try to buy that cell phone in a year, it'll be a lot cheaper, right? Yeah. Televisions. I mean, I remember the first time I bought a high def TV, it was one of the 1080p ones, 40 inches. The thing weighed 40 pounds. It was $1,500. Now you can go to Best Buy and buy a 55-inch 4K TV that weighs 4 pounds. And those things are $300, right? But nobody says, I'm not going to buy a TV. I'm not going to buy a computer. The truth is that people do buy the things that they want. And most of our spending, for most of us, right? Housing, food, cars, these are things that people are not going without. Nobody says, I'm going to live on the street because I'll be able to rent cheaper next year. So I just don't buy these arguments. On top of that, the real issue with inflation is it represents theft by the government, right? When you have a loss of purchasing power, right? Think about it. Think about the things that you would buy 10 years ago or your grocery bill. And now the same amount of money doesn't buy you the same amount. The purchasing power of your dollar declines every year. Where does that value go? The truth is it's called seniorage. And it is being that value is being stolen by the government. And you think, okay, well, what is 2% a big deal? Right? I was going to buy a candy bar for $1. Next year, it'd be $1 who cares? Well, over a 40-year working life, we talked about this before. A 2% inflation rate robs you of 55% of the value of your money. So let's say we move that target to 4%. That theft becomes 79%. These are the easy numbers that we can talk about. This is a huge amount of theft by the government every year. The correct, proper, and moral rate of inflation is 0. And by the way, the mandate of the Federal Reserve is for stable prices. That's 0% inflation. Now, for those of you who disagree with me, who think we need inflation to have GDP growth, great. Put it in the comments, but use the word because. Tell me why we have more economic growth when prices are constantly rising, right? Not nominal growth, real growth. And I'll respond. I'd love to know your thoughts on it, but now you know mine.
Yeah, please do. Please like a comment, or maybe you might not like it if you disagree with Gary.
Dislike
At
it. Go
least comment.
ahead.
Yeah,
Right.
there we go. Thumbs down. Any engagement is good engagement around here. That's
Sure.
what
Yeah.
we
If
encourage.
here, you know what? For everybody on this, everybody says, yes, please like, please subscribe. You know what? If you think we need inflation, go ahead, hit the dislike button, go for it. But if you're going to do it, put it in the comments, use the word because, tell me why you disagree. I'll respond to everything on there.
Dislike, comment, and share it with all your friends and tell them how dumb we are. How about
That's
that?
right. Yeah.
I like that.
Right.
Okay. Moving to thing number 5, Gary, of the economic humor issue. Going back to commercial real estate disaster, starting with office space.
Yeah. So unfortunately, this one isn't funny. I know, we've been laughing our way through this episode and, there was a lot of funny news. This one is not funny. So I grew up with family in Pittsburgh, and a lot of our family vacations involved driving from Detroit to Pittsburgh and seeing family there. And I have wonderful memories of that city. I've always loved Pittsburgh, my family there, the people there. It is a terrific place. And, people had this impression of Pittsburgh as this dirty, grimy steel town, and it's completely changed. It's clean, it's beautiful, it's a great sports town, completely revitalized downtown with a great music scene. It really is a terrific place. And the news there is that projections are, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is reporting that within 4 years, 50% of Pittsburgh office space could be vacant. If that happens, landlords are going to start closing down office buildings. They'll mothball it. There's nothing you can do. I know people say, oh, you just convert an office building to apartments. That's very hard to do. It's very expensive. And a lot of office buildings aren't really suited. You'd have to gut the entire thing. And even then, it's not so easy. So we could be seeing a ton of office buildings closing down there. This is, 2 times in 2 weeks. We're highlighting huge problems in the commercial real estate market.
Yeah, at Flying V Group, Gary, we operate more or less. We have office space, but a remote workforce primarily, right? Do you see any way back for this? I know there's conversations about, hey, we're seeing this big jump back to, in office, in-person workforce. I don't know that I see it. I understand the pros and the cons on both sides of the argument, but got to be a big reason for these issues in office space.
Yeah. So look, Rob, big picture, it's not looking good. We have seen, some of the tech firms out in California, some of the big finance firms in New York have had success forcing their people back into the office. But one of the reasons they've been able to do that is both of those have workforces that are extremely well paid and where people just have insane work ethics, right? I mean, my first 2 years, I was working in the M&A department at Morgan Stanley. We were all working 80 to 100 hours a week, sometimes more. There aren't a lot of people who will do that, but these jobs in finance and tech tend to be well paid. People are really motivated. As for the rest of the country, they have no interest in going back to the office. Last year, I was at the IMN real estate conference in Newport, and I was with a lot of people who are commercial real estate investors, and they kept telling me, no, this work from home thing is going to end. People are going to go back to the office. They're not going to have a choice. They want to return to the office. And, I was very careful. Internally, I'm thinking to myself, there's no way. People don't want to go back. Like, no one wants to be in the office, certainly not 5 days a week. And I was very skeptical, but I was careful about what I said because I was talking to people who do this for a living. And I recognize that they know the office space market, the commercial real estate market better than I do. And so I mostly just listened. I asked some questions, but I didn't really say a lot. But the whole time I was thinking, I just don't see it. I don't think people want to go back to the office. And, here we are a year later and, looking at vacancy rates of 50%. I think I saw card swipe data in New York that we're at something like 65%. That's from memory. I could be wrong on that number. Somebody can feel free to check that one, put that in the comments. But basically, I think we're going to see a lot of office closures. I think we're going to see banks taking huge write-downs on this stuff, most of the world has realized that they're able to work effectively from home without getting in the car and commuting and having to buy $20 sandwiches from the place down the corner.
Great points, as always, Gary, on this week's version of the 5 things from Deep Knowledge Investing. This week's version, the economic humor issue. I'd like to again thank our sponsor, Unicus Research, for sponsoring this week's episode and the written 5 things. Remember, please sign up on our website if you haven't already. We have a free version of the newsletter that will go out, notify you of new posts, as well as consideration for a premium subscription that'll allow you access to everything that goes up on the DKI website, current recommendations, buys, when we sell, and the whole 9 yards there. Gary, as always, great work. Any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Always fun doing this with you. Want to compliment Andrew on the way he's been putting together all the different videos on this. I know Alex over at Flying V has done an incredible job on some of the branding stuff. He's been a huge contributor. And we also have a bunch of people, Jonalyn, Maria at Benzinga, who help us distribute. It's fun for me to get on and talk about this stuff, but there are a lot of people behind the scenes supporting me, supporting you, Rob, supporting Deep Knowledge Investing and Flying V, and they're super important to us. So I just wanted to mention a few of them by name and thank them personally. Also want to thank Phil Kessler, member of the DKI Board of Advisors. There are very few people who would wade in and read a government bill to come on for 10 minutes and give his opinion. But, if it's a legal thing, Phil's always my first call. So thank you to Phil and to you, Rob. And I'm just grateful for all of you.
Thanks, Gary. See everybody next week.